"Don't step there," the waitress said, her voice barely rising above the soft hum of conversations and clinking glasses, but something in the way she said it, calm, certain, cut through the noise like a blade. And Daniel Whitmore, a man who built billion-dollar towers and trusted steel more than people, paused mid-step on the glass floor that stretched across the 60th level of his newest skyscraper, 800 feet above the city lights. The skyline shimmering beneath his polished shoes, he frowned. Slightly, not used to being interrupted, especially not by someone in a simple black uniform holding a tray of sparkling water. But her eyes didn't look apologetic. They looked focused, almost calculating, as if she wasn't seeing him at all, but something beneath him, something everyone else had missed, the guests around them barely noticed, still laughing, still raising glasses, still trusting the flawless glass beneath their feet. Because why wouldn't they? This building was his masterpiece. Engineered to perfection, inspected, approved, celebrated. And yet Emily Carter didn't move, her fingers tightening subtly around the tray, her gaze fixed on a single point just inches from where his foot hovered, a place where the reflection of the chandelier above flickered ever so slightly, a distortion so small it could have been dismissed as a trick of light. But she didn't dismiss it. She never dismissed things like that. "Sir," she added softly, just enough to hold him there for one more second, and in that second, the air shifted, the faintest sound, almost like a whisper, slipped through the room, a tiny crack beneath layers of confidence and glass. Daniel's eyes narrowed, not in fear but in curiosity, because for the first time that evening, something didn't align with his certainty. And then it happened. The surface beneath where he was about to step gave way with a sharp, echoing snap, the pristine glass collapsing into darkness below, a sudden absence where there should have been solid ground. The room froze. Conversations died mid-sentence, and Daniel Whitmore stood there, perfectly still, one step away from nothing, his heartbeat loud in his ears as he slowly turned his head back toward the waitress who had stopped him without raising her voice, without making a scene, just a single sentence at the exact right moment. She met his gaze evenly, her expression unchanged, as if this wasn't luck, as if this wasn't a guess, but something she had seen coming long before anyone else thought to look. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt something unfamiliar settle beneath his confidence. Not fear, not yet, but a question, quiet and persistent. How did she know? For a moment, no one moved. The kind of silence that did not come from calm, but from disbelief. The kind that settles when reality shifts just slightly off balance. And Daniel Whitmore felt every eye in the room turn toward him, not because he was the most powerful man there, but because he was the one who had almost taken that step. His jaw tightened, not out of fear but control. The same control that had built his empire from concrete and certainty. Yet something had slipped through that control tonight. Something he could not immediately explain. His gaze returned to Emily Carter, still standing with the tray in her hands as if nothing extraordinary had happened, her posture straight, her breathing steady. The only sign of tension was the faint pressure of her fingers against the glass she was holding. "Clear the floor," someone shouted in the distance, voices overlapping now, security moving in, guests stepping back from the shattered section. But Daniel did not move, not yet. His attention fixed on her. "You," he said finally, his voice low but carrying across the noise. She looked up, not startled, not intimidated, just present. "How did you know that was going to happen?" he asked, and it was not an accusation. It was a question he needed answered, because men like Daniel Whitmore did not believe in coincidence. Emily hesitated for half a second, not because she was afraid, but because she was choosing her words. "I did not know," she said quietly, and for a brief moment, irritation flickered in his eyes, until she added, "I noticed something." That was enough to hold his attention. "What did you notice?" he pressed, stepping closer now, the distance between them shrinking, not as employer and server, but as two people standing on opposite sides of the same moment. Emily glanced toward the broken glass, then back at him. "The reflection," she said, her voice still calm. "It was off, just slightly, like the surface was not holding evenly." Daniel followed her line of sight, replaying the image in his mind, the chandelier above, the polished floor, the symmetry he had approved himself. "That is not enough to predict a collapse," he said, almost to himself. But she heard it. It is enough to question it, she replied, and something in that answer landed differently. Not defensive, not proud, just certain, around them. The room was slowly regaining its movement, guests whispering, managers apologizing, but the space between them felt separate, quieter, as if the world had narrowed to this exchange. Daniel studied her more carefully now. Not her uniform, not her role, but the details he had overlooked before, the way her eyes moved, observant, precise, the way she stood, balanced, aware of her surroundings. This was not random. This was not luck. "What is your name?" he asked. And this time, there was no impatience in his voice. "Emily Carter," she answered, and he nodded once, committing it to memory. "Emily," he repeated, as if testing it, then his gaze sharpened slightly. "Have we met before?" The question hung there, not because he recognized her face, but because something about her felt familiar in a way he could not place. Emily's expression did not change, but there was a pause, small, almost invisible. "No, sir," she said, and the answer was simple, clean, but not complete. And Daniel Whitmore, who had built his life reading what was not said, felt it immediately. Something was missing, something she was choosing not to reveal, and for the first time that evening, the collapse beneath his feet was no longer the most interesting thing that had happened. Daniel did not look away, not even as the noise of the room began to return in fragments, voices lowering, footsteps shifting cautiously across the remaining glass, because something in Emily Carter's answer had unsettled him in a way the collapse itself had not. He had built entire companies on instinct sharpened by data, patterns, signals that others ignored. And now he was looking at someone who had done the same thing in a single moment, without a title, without recognition, without anything to gain. "You noticed a reflection," he said slowly, as if testing the weight of her words, "and you decided to stop me." Emily nodded once, her grip on the tray finally relaxing slightly. "It did not look right," she repeated, and the simplicity of it made it harder to dismiss, because it was not dramatic, it was not exaggerated, it was observation, pure and unfiltered. Daniel exhaled quietly, his mind already moving past the surface of the situation, tracing backward, because structures did not fail without reason. Not his structures, not the ones he had approved personally. "This floor was inspected 3 times, he said, more to himself than to her. "Every panel stress tested beyond standard requirements." Emily did not respond immediately, and that silence again felt intentional, not empty. He looked at her again, sharper this time. "You disagree." It was not a question. Emily shifted her weight slightly, a subtle movement that suggested she was choosing whether to step further into a space she did not belong to, at least not officially. "I think," she began carefully, "that inspections confirm what is expected, not always what is possible." Daniel's eyes narrowed just a fraction, not in anger, but in recognition, because that was not something a typical server would say, not in that way, not with that clarity. Around them, a manager approached cautiously, speaking about safety protocols, about temporary closure of the glass section, about ensuring the guests were comfortable. But Daniel raised a hand without looking, silencing the explanation before it could begin. His attention remained on Emily. "What do you mean by that?" he asked. And now there was something else in his voice, not authority, not impatience, but curiosity sharpened into focus. Emily glanced briefly at the edge of the broken section again, then back at him. "Materials behave differently under real conditions," she said. "Temperature, weight distribution. Microfractures that do not show during standard testing." She stopped there, as if aware she had already said too much. Daniel studied her in silence, the pieces beginning to align in a way that made his chest tighten slightly, not from fear, but from realization. "You have seen this before," he said quietly. Emily did not answer right away, and that pause was enough. He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough that the conversation became theirs alone. "Not in theory," he added. "In practice." Emily's eyes flickered for a brief second, something passing through them too quickly for anyone else to notice. But Daniel saw it, because he was looking for it now. "I used to study structural engineering," she said finally. The words simple, but the impact immediate. Daniel leaned back slightly, reassessing everything he thought he understood about the moment, about her. About why a waitress had just prevented a failure his own team had not anticipated. Used to, he repeated. Why stop? Emily looked down for a fraction of a second, then back up, her expression returning to that same calm neutrality. Life changed, she said, and it was an answer that closed more doors than it opened. But Daniel did not push further, not yet, because something deeper had already taken hold, a question that extended beyond her past and into his present. If she was right about this, if one small detail could be missed in something this critical, then what else had he not seen? And for the first time since the glass had given way beneath that single step, Daniel Whitmore was not thinking about the fall that almost happened. He was thinking about the flaw that had been there all along. The word lingered between them longer than it should have. Structural engineering, not spoken with pride, not offered as a revelation, just placed there like a quiet fact. And Daniel Whitmore felt something shift again, deeper this time, because it was no longer about a single moment of observation. It was about context, about experience, about someone who understood the language his buildings were written in. You studied it, he said, his voice lower now, measured. At what level? Emily adjusted the tray slightly, as if grounding herself in something familiar before answering. University, she said. 3 years. Daniel's gaze sharpened. Calculating without appearing to. 3 years was not casual interest. It was foundation, discipline, the kind of training that taught you not just how to build, but how to question what was built. And you left, he said. Again, not a question. Emily nodded once, her expression steady. I had to, she replied, and there was no elaboration, no explanation offered. But Daniel did not need one to understand that whatever had pulled her away had not been a lack of ability. It rarely was. His attention shifted briefly to the broken section again, now surrounded by staff placing temporary barriers, the jagged edge catching the light in uneven fragments. And for the first time, he looked at it not as an isolated failure, but as evidence, a symptom of something deeper, something systemic. This building passed every inspection, he said, slowly, more to himself than to her. Every report signed, every metric within tolerance. Emily listened, but did not interrupt. So either every engineer involved missed something, he continued, or something changed after the fact. His eyes returned to her, searching now, not for confirmation, but for contradiction. Emily hesitated, then spoke carefully. Sometimes nothing changes, she said. Sometimes the problem was always there, just small enough to hide. The sentence settled heavily. Not dramatic, not confrontational, just precise. And Daniel felt it land in a place he had not expected, because it challenged something fundamental, not just about this structure, but about his process, his certainty, around them. The event was slowly reorganizing itself, guests being guided towards safer areas, conversations resuming in cautious tones, but the center of Daniel's focus had narrowed completely. If you saw it, he said, why did no one else? Emily gave a slight, almost imperceptible shrug. They were not looking for it, she answered. They were looking for confirmation. Daniel let out a quiet breath, the distinction clear, uncomfortable, accurate. He had built teams that excelled at validation, at meeting expectations, at proving that systems worked as designed, but not always at challenging the design itself. And now a single overlooked detail had nearly rewritten the outcome of this entire evening. Come with me, he said suddenly, the decision forming as he spoke it. Emily blinked once, caught off guard for the first time. Sir, she began, instinctively glancing toward the other table she was responsible for, but he interrupted gently, not with authority, but with intent. Just for a moment, he said, already turning toward the secured edge of the floor, where the broken section was being examined more closely. Something in his tone made it clear this was not a request born of impulse. It was necessity. Emily hesitated for only a second before following, setting the tray down on a nearby table, her movements efficient, controlled, as if stepping into a role she had not occupied in a long time. When they reached the edge, Daniel gestured toward the fracture line. Show me, he said, and for a brief moment, Emily Carter stood between two worlds, one she had been forced into, and one she had left behind, and the silence before she responded felt heavier than anything that had happened so far. Emily did not move immediately, her eyes resting on the fractured edge as if she was listening to something beneath the surface, something no one else could hear, the noise around them fading again into the background. And Daniel Whitmore waited, not with impatience, but with a focus that felt different from anything he had shown that evening. Because this was no longer about authority, it was about understanding. Finally, Emily stepped closer, careful, precise, stopping just short of the secured boundary, her gaze tracing the irregular line where the glass had given way. "Right there," she said softly, not pointing at the largest break, but slightly to the side of it, a place most people would ignore. Daniel followed her indication, narrowing his eyes. "That section looks intact," he said. And it was true. Compared to the obvious damage, it appeared almost untouched. Emily shook her head slightly. "It looks intact," she corrected gently, "but it is not holding the same load." Daniel crouched slightly, lowering his perspective, studying the surface more closely. And then he saw it. Not a crack, not a break, but a faint shift in the way the light bent across the panel. A subtle inconsistency that should not have been there. "Stress imbalance," he murmured, the words coming automatically now. Emily nodded. "The panel next to it likely carried more weight than it was designed for," she said, her tone steady, clinical, as if she had stepped fully back into a role she once knew well. Which means the support underneath was not distributing force evenly. Daniel's mind moved quickly, mapping the structure beneath their feet, the grid, the supports, the calculations he had approved months ago. "That would not happen without a flaw in installation or design," he said, more firmly now. Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second, then spoke. "Or a flaw that was documented and ignored." The sentence landed quietly, but it shifted. "Everything." Daniel straightened slowly, his gaze lifting from the glass to her face, searching again, deeper this time. "Ignored by who?" he asked, and the question carried weight, not accusation, but consequence. Emily did not answer immediately, her eyes returning to the fractured edge, as if the truth was written there, not in words, but in patterns. "When systems are large," she said carefully, "responsibility becomes shared. And shared responsibility is easy to overlook." Daniel held her gaze, recognizing the deflection, not as avoidance, but as protection, and that told him even more. "You have seen reports like that?" he said quietly. Emily's expression remained composed, but there was a subtle tightening in her posture, a memory surfacing just beneath the calm. "Yes," she said finally, a single word, but enough. Around them, engineers from his team had begun to arrive, speaking in technical terms, already forming explanations, already building a narrative that would fit within acceptable limits. But Daniel did not turn toward them, not yet, because the most honest analysis he had heard so far had come from someone who was not supposed to be part of this conversation. "If this was missed once," he said, almost to himself, "it can be missed again." Emily did not respond, but her silence was agreement, and that was all he needed. He looked back at the fracture one last time, then at her, something shifting behind his eyes, not just curiosity now, but decision. "Emily," he said, her name no longer tentative, no longer distant. "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, my office." She blinked, caught off guard again. "Sir, I do not think that is appropriate," she began, instinctively stepping back into the boundaries of her current role, but he shook his head slightly, not dismissive, but certain. "What is not appropriate," he said, "is ignoring what you just saw." The words hung there, firm, undeniable, and for a moment, Emily Carter stood in the space between what she had left behind and what was being offered again, and the question was no longer whether she could see the flaw, but whether she was willing to step back into a world that had once turned away from her. The room had almost returned to normal, almost, but not quite, because something invisible had shifted beneath the polished surface of the evening, something no one could fully name, and Emily Carter felt it as she picked up her tray again. The familiar weight grounding her in a role she understood, a role that asked nothing more than quiet efficiency and polite distance. She moved between tables with practiced ease, refilling glasses, offering composed smiles, but her mind was no longer entirely there. It lingered at the edge of broken glass and a question she had spent years avoiding. Across the room, Daniel Whitmore stood apart from the conversations that attempted to resume around him, his attention divided between the engineers now speaking rapidly about load distribution and safety redundancies, and the single moment that had not aligned with any report or projection. He listened, but not fully, because every explanation felt incomplete, polished, acceptable, but missing. The one detail that mattered, the detail that had been seen by someone who was not even supposed to be looking. "We will need a full structural review," one of the senior engineers was saying, outlining steps. "Timelines, procedures." Daniel nodded slightly, but his gaze drifted again, finding Emily as she moved through the room, blending back into the background as if nothing had happened. And that, more than anything, unsettled him, because someone who could see what she had seen should not disappear so easily. "Mr. Whitmore." Another voice interrupted, but he raised his hand again, signaling that the discussion could wait, because there was something more immediate, something less comfortable, and far more important. He crossed the room with deliberate steps, not hurried, not dramatic, just certain. Emily noticed him before he reached her, not by sound, but by presence, the subtle shift in attention that follows power. She turned slightly, setting down a glass before meeting his gaze again, calm as before. "You did not answer me," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of the formality that had defined him earlier. Emily tilted her head slightly. "I believe I did," she replied, her tone respectful but steady. Daniel shook his head once. "Not completely," he said. And there it was again, that quiet insistence that made it difficult to step away. "You said you studied structural engineering," he continued. "You said you noticed something others did not, and you said flaws can be ignored." He paused, just long enough for the weight of those statements to settle. "That does not come from observation alone." Emily held his gaze, and for a moment, the space between them felt narrower than before, not defined by status, but by truth waiting just beneath the surface. She exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but acceptance, as if recognizing that this conversation was no longer avoidable. "A year ago," she began quietly, "I interned with a firm that reviewed large-scale commercial projects." Daniel's expression did not change, but his attention sharpened instantly. "Including this one," she added, and that was the moment everything shifted again, not with noise, not with shock, but with clarity. Daniel's mind moved quickly, searching through layers of reports, approvals, signatures, trying to recall any name, any detail that connected to the person standing in front of him. Now, but there was nothing, no record that matched what he was seeing. "That is not possible," he said automatically, not dismissing her, but rejecting the gap in his own knowledge. Emily's expression remained calm, but there was something else now, something quieter, heavier. "It is," she said. "I filed a concern about load distribution inconsistencies in glass panel alignment." The words were precise, deliberate, each one carrying the weight of something that had once mattered deeply. Daniel felt a slow, controlled breath leave his chest, because this was no longer about a random moment or an overlooked detail. This was about a warning that had existed before tonight ever began. "What happened to that report?" he asked, and this time, there was no distance left in his voice. Emily looked at him steadily, not accusing, not emotional, just honest. "It was acknowledged," she said, and then it was set aside. And in that quiet sentence, the real fracture revealed itself, not in the glass beneath their feet, but in the system that had chosen not to see it. The words settled between them with a weight that no one else in the room could feel, not the guests returning to their conversations, not the engineers assembling their explanations, because what Emily had just revealed was not a mistake. It was a decision, and Daniel Whitmore understood the difference immediately. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. "The kind that comes when something you trusted reveals a quiet flaw beneath its surface. Set aside," he repeated, slowly, as if testing whether the phrase could possibly mean something less than what it sounded like. But it did not. Emily did not look away, did not soften it. "Yes," she said, and there was no bitterness in her tone, only clarity, as if she had already processed the disappointment long before this moment. Daniel's mind moved quickly, tracing back through layers of management, approvals, timelines. He knew how decisions like that happened, not through one person, but through many small choices, each one reasonable on its own, each one justifiable, until the sum of them created something no one intended. Why? He asked, and this time the question carried something deeper, not just curiosity, but accountability. Emily exhaled quietly, her gaze drifting for a moment toward the city lights beyond the glass. Because it did not fail on paper, she said. The numbers were within tolerance. The models predicted stability, and the concern was classified as low probability. She paused briefly, then added, low probability is easy to ignore when the cost of delay is high. Daniel felt that sentence land harder than anything else, because he had been the one pushing timelines, pushing completion dates, pushing for perfection on schedule, not just perfection itself. And now he was standing in a space where that pressure had translated into silence. And you, he said, his voice quieter now. What happened after you filed it? Emily's expression remained composed, but something in her posture shifted slightly, a memory resurfacing. I was told to focus on assigned tasks, she replied. That my role was to observe, not to challenge final decisions. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, not in frustration, but in acknowledgement, because he had heard versions of that sentence before, in meetings, in reviews, in conversations where hierarchy mattered more than insight. So you left, he said, and this time it was not an assumption, it was understanding. Emily nodded once. I finished the internship, she said, but I did not continue. Daniel looked at her again, not as a waitress, not as someone out of place, but as someone who had stepped away from a system that had not been ready to listen. And yet, when the moment came, she had still chosen to act, still chosen to speak, even when no one expected her to, even when it was not her responsibility anymore. You could have said nothing tonight, he said quietly. Emily met his gaze, steady as before. I saw it, she replied. That made it my responsibility. The simplicity of it stripped away every excuse, every justification, leaving only the truth of the choice she had made. Daniel let out a slow breath, his shoulders settling slightly as something within him shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but fundamentally, because this was no longer about a flaw in glass or steel. It was about a flaw in attention, in listening, in the way decisions were filtered before they ever reached him. He turned slightly, glancing toward his team, still speaking in controlled, confident tones, unaware that the most critical detail had already been uncovered. Then back to Emily, his voice quieter now, but more certain than before. Tomorrow still stands, he said, not as an order, not as a request, but as an acknowledgement of something that could not be ignored anymore. Emily hesitated for a brief moment, the weight of that invitation settling differently now, not just an opportunity, but a return to something she had chosen to leave behind. And for the first time since she had spoken, there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, not about what she knew, but about whether she was willing to step back into a world that had once chosen not to hear her. And Daniel Whitmore, standing there in the quiet aftermath of a failure that almost happened, understood that the next decision would not be his to make. Emily did not answer right away, the invitation still hanging between them, heavier now than it had been a few moments ago, because it no longer sounded like a simple request. It sounded like a doorway, one that led back to a world she had deliberately stepped away from. She lowered her gaze briefly, not out of hesitation, but reflection, as if weighing something deeper than the words themselves. Around them, the evening continued to recover, conversations rebuilding, laughter returning in cautious fragments, the kind that tries to smooth over what just happened, but cannot quite erase it. Daniel Whitmore remained still, not pressing, not filling the silence, because for the first time, he understood that control did not belong to him in this moment, and that understanding was unfamiliar, but necessary. Emily finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. You already have a team, she said, not as a refusal, but as a statement of fact. Daniel nodded once. I do, he replied, and they are very good at confirming what they expect to see. His tone was not critical, but it carried a quiet realization that had not been there before. Emily looked at him again, searching, not for authority, but for intent. And you think I would do something different? She asked. Daniel held her gaze, unflinching. You already did, he said, and the simplicity of that answer left no room for deflection. Emily exhaled slowly, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table beside her, grounding herself again, because this was no longer about what she knew. It was about whether she was willing to be seen for it. What happens when I say something you do not want to hear? She asked quietly, and the question cut deeper than anything before it, not challenging his intelligence, but his willingness to listen. Daniel did not answer immediately, and that pause mattered, because it was honest, not rehearsed. He looked briefly toward the fractured glass again, then back at her. Then I will have to decide whether I want the truth or the comfort of being right, he said, his voice calm, but firm, and in that moment something shifted between them again. Not power, not hierarchy, but alignment. Emily studied him for a second longer, as if testing whether those words could hold under pressure, whether they would remain the same outside this moment. And then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not agreement. Not yet, but acknowledgement. 8 o'clock, she said quietly, and the words were simple, but they carried weight, because they were not just about time. They were about choice. Daniel inclined his head slightly, accepting it without comment, without triumph, just recognition. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence no longer tense, but settled, as if something had found its place. A manager approached cautiously from the side, addressing Emily about returning to her section, about guests who needed attention, and she nodded, stepping back into motion with the same quiet efficiency as before. But something about her presence had changed, not visible to most, but unmistakable to one person in the room. Daniel watched her for a moment as she moved away, blending again into the rhythm of service, and yet no longer invisible, not to him, not anymore. He turned back toward his team, their voices filled with structured explanations and controlled language. But now he heard them differently, not as final answers, but as filtered interpretations, and for the first time, he wondered how many other details had passed through that filter unnoticed, how many other voices had been softened, redirected, or set aside. The city lights beyond the glass reflected in the remaining panels, steady, unchanged, but beneath them, something had shifted, quietly, permanently, and as Daniel Whitmore stood there in the aftermath of what almost happened, he understood that the real reconstruction would not begin with the building. It would begin with the way he chose to listen. The next morning arrived without announcement, just a quiet shift in light as the city woke beneath layers of glass and steel. And at exactly 8 o'clock, Daniel Whitmore stood in his office on the 60th floor, not near the edge this time, but behind a wide desk that had always represented control, precision, certainty. Yet today, something about that certainty felt different, not gone, but questioned. The events of the previous night replaying in fragments, not the collapse itself, but the moment before it, the pause, the voice, the choice. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts, measured, not hesitant, and he knew who it was before he said anything. "Come in," he said, his voice calm, steady. The door opened, and Emily Carter stepped inside. No tray this time, no uniform that blended her into the background, just a simple, clean presence that felt almost unfamiliar in this space. She paused briefly near the doorway, not uncertain, but aware of the shift, because this room was built for decisions, not observations. Daniel studied her for a moment, taking in the difference, not in appearance, but in context. Last night, she had been part of the environment. Today, she was standing in the center of it. "You came," he said, not as a test, but as acknowledgement. Emily nodded once. "You asked," she replied, her tone the same as before, calm, direct, without any attempt to impress. Daniel gestured toward the table beside his desk, where a set of blueprints lay open. The structural plans of the building, detailed, precise, complete, at least on paper. "Show me what we missed," he said, and there was no preamble, no explanation, just the question that mattered. Emily stepped forward, her eyes moving across the drawings with a familiarity that returned almost instantly, as if she had never really left this world. Her fingers hovered just above the surface, not touching yet, tracing lines, intersections, load paths, the quiet language of structure. The room fell silent again, not empty, but focused. "Here," she said after a moment, her finger resting lightly near a junction point between panels, not the obvious center, but slightly offset. Daniel moved closer, following her indication. This section distributes load across 3 supports, he said, recalling the design. Emily nodded. On paper, she replied. But in reality, slight variations in installation shift the balance. She traced a line outward. If this support carries even 5% less load than expected, the adjacent panel compensates. Daniel felt his attention sharpen further, the numbers aligning with what he had seen, what he had almost stepped onto, and over time, he added quietly. Emily looked at him briefly, then back to the plans. Stress accumulates, she finished, and the simplicity of it made it undeniable. No dramatic failure, no sudden flaw, just a slow, quiet imbalance that grew until one moment made it visible. Daniel straightened slightly, the implications expanding beyond a single panel, beyond a single building. How many other sections like this? He asked, not looking away from the blueprint. Emily did not answer immediately, and that pause was enough. He looked up at her, and for the first time, the full scope of the question settled between them. Not just how many here, but how many everywhere. How many times something small had been overlooked because it did not fail fast enough to demand attention. Emily met his gaze steadily. That depends, she said, her voice quiet but clear, on how many times no one was looking for it. The words lingered in the room, not as a conclusion, but as an opening, and Daniel Whitmore, standing in front of the plans he had trusted, without question, realized that the real structure he needed to rebuild was not made of glass or steel, but of something far less visible, and far more important, the way he chose to see what others did not.